everyone, it's Northern Kayak Angler here, and today I wanted to do a quick video about vertical jigging for walleye in the St. Clair and the Detroit River. For those of you who know me, you know that my favorite thing to fish for is walleye. It is the area I have the most expertise in personally. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I wanted to go over some of the things that to make me successful vertical jigging on the St. Clair River, because I get a lot of questions online about fishing for walleye and people are really interested in learning how. And I find that people have questions, especially from a kayak, even from boat, because there's a lot of people who are new to walleye fishing, new to fishing, and it's something they're really interested in doing because walleye is a great fish to cook up when you get home. And so it's one of those things I have a lot of questions about. So I wanted to go over some of the things I use to be successful vertical jigging. If you know me, I fish from a kayak. It's where I have most of my experience, but it translates both to boats and for kayaks. And for those of you guys who have questions on how I control my kayak to be successful in the St. Clair River, I might do a follow-up video on that. But if you watch my videos on YouTube, you'll kind of see how I control my kayak in the current. I do tend to face my kayak in the direction of the current, so I'm facing upriver as I drift down, and I find that is the best position for my kayak. With the Hobie kayak, I'm really able to keep my kayak on position because I'm able to kind of flutter kick the fins. So that's helpful for me. That's just the experience that I have kayak fishing. But the St. Clair River, the current is very strong. It's about 230,000 cubic feet per second running through that river, depending on where you're at in the width of the river. So for me, when I'm vertical jigging, I am using 1 ounce jig heads. So these are some jig heads I picked up from Dead End Tackle. These are ones I tend to use only because I like this fish head with the big eyes. And I like these solid red hooks on there. They're not all red. You'll see those are solid hooks, and my hookup ratio is very good, even with just using a jig head. So for the St. Clair River, I'm using 1 ounce jig heads. Sometime in the summer, I will kind of do a 3/4 ounce jig head occasionally. I do successfully catch walleye in the summer on a lighter jig head, and that might just because they tend to be a little more suspended. But early in the season, I'm using a 1 ounce jig head to maintain that contact on the river bottom. The rods that I mainly use a 6/6 rod. I personally use a medium heavy with a fast action. Some of my rods are medium power, but they're all kind of like a faster action. And I find that a 6/6 rod is the best way to feel that bottom because it's a shorter rod. You really want to be able to feel that you're on the bottom, what you're hitting, and have perfect control and feeling that lure, because really the depth of the vertical jig is what's going to make you successful. When you're looking at your fish finder, you can see where those fish are feeding. If they're chasing those shad, those bait balls down the river, you're going to see that on your fish finder, and you're going to be able to have that success of how high you're vertical jigging. There are days where I'm just slightly bouncing off the bottom, and that is successful as well. Some of my favorites, my main thing that I'm using on my jig head is a Mr. Twister double tail in white. I tend to have more success off white. Sometimes I will tip it with a worm when I'm walleye fishing. So I'll tip it with a worm. If there are days where the walleye are a little bit more finicky, if you can get a jig head, and I don't have a good example here because I'm all out. If you can get a 1 ounce, just plain silver, no paint jig head on there and only put a worm on it, there are days where the walleye will just eat that up like no tomorrow. So you kind of have to vary. I know there's some walleye anglers that don't use live bait at all. Walleye fishing, some days I do, some days I don't. But sometimes if you just tip a plain jig head with a worm on there, they cannot resist that. You don't always need to have a Mr. Twister or any other soft plastic bait on the back. There's days where they're not gonna want that. So just kind of vary it up and see. You gotta figure out what the fish want and what they're biting on that day. So those are just a couple tips that I use to be more successful. In the kayak, I am using braid on all of my reels. And that's because there's no flex. So if you want a good hookup ratio, especially from a kayak when you're lower on the water, braid doesn't flex. You're gonna get a better hook set when you're using braid. And now I do use fluorocarbon. Really often I will tie on fluorocarbon. I have 12-pound test that I use, Sunline. I have 8-pound test that I use, and I won't make my leader very long at all. And what I'll do is I'll tie it onto my braid in a double Alberto knot is my preferred knot. I seem to have a lot of success with that one. So I find that braid, because of the lack of stretch, you'll get a better hookup ratio. Now, some of the other things that I recommend for vertical jigging is keeping your rod tip lower to the water when you're jigging. I see a lot of guys holding their rod way up in the air, going like this, and maybe if your boat that works for you. But in my experience, keep that tip lower to the water, to the surface of the water. And the reason being, you'll give yourself more room for a hook set, and you won't have to reef up. Do not reef up. You don't need to. Slight pressure, start reeling, and you'll hook those fish in. But if you keep that rod tip lower to the water versus up here, you'll get a better hook set. That's just my experience. That's how I fish. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I do think keeping your rod tip lower to the water helps you get a better hook set. So that's just my opinion. And the other thing that I would say helps is having a stinger hook. I don't use stinger hooks overly often. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just get lazy or I lose them a lot and I don't use them. But it will really help you. And there's two ways, and this might sound really weird to some people, but there's actually, sometimes I make my own stinger hooks. This is one that I bought. So you can either keep them on the hook like this, so you can put it on the hook, making sure to keep it straight. And I might hook it into the tail a little bit. Sometimes I'll even, when I'm tying it on, I'll tie it on to the line up here and keep it straight. The other thing I do, which some people might think this is weird, I'll make my own stinger hooks out of drop shots. I'll use fluorocarbon and I'll tie them on, especially if I catch and release. Sometimes I go out fishing, I don't want to keep them, and I'll just go out after work and catch and release. And I'll make my own stinger hooks out of a simple drop shot hook instead of using the treble. And it works. I know that might sound weird, but that's what I do. So like I said, Mr. Twister, when you're putting those on there, the key is always presentation. So make sure that is a completely straight worm presentation or trailer presentation. One of the other, I picked up these Z-Man razor shads, and I picked these up specifically for bass fishing, but I might actually try these for walleye fishing this year. If you're familiar with Z-Man products, you'll know that these things last forever. You can use them again and again. This might be a little bit, so this is like a 4-inch razor shad, that's 4.5. So I might actually trim this down a little bit if I do end up using it for walleye. But I'm interested in using the action of that tail to see how that gets me. That will be a little bit of an experiment for me. So that's one of the trailers, but my go-to trailer is white double tail Mr. Twister. You will almost always find that on there. Maybe with a little bit of scent, maybe tipped with worm, maybe nothing at all, but that's what I use there. So I've gone over basically the main things that I'm using. Follow up on some of my videos. For kayak fishing, what I'll do a lot of the time, because the river current is so quick, I'll actually drift down where I want to in the river, where I think those walleye are staging up in the spring. And I will drift down, but I'll actually troll a crankbait on the way back. And one of my favorites is just a Rapala, flicker shad, flicker minnow, and a very narrow profile. Sometimes I'll troll those on the way back up. And it just helps you save time on the water. So you can have more success if you're jigging downriver and as with trolling back up. Have your line in twice as long. So if it takes you a little bit of time to pedal back up the river, kind of keep it in mind. Why not just troll a crankbait on the way back up to double your success rate? So that's some of the tips that I have there. And the other thing, when you are vertical jigging, it's very important for you to make sure your line is always vertical. And if you're new, don't give up when you're fishing these bigger river systems, especially from a kayak. You are going to figure out what works for you. Sometimes it takes you a little bit because the water or the wind, it can spin you around. If you can maintain vertical presentation at all times, you're going to be successful. So it might take you, it's a learning experience. It was a learning experience for me when I first started fishing out of a kayak. But make sure your line is always vertical. It is the number one way you're going to be successful. And if you ever do get a day that's windy and you just can't keep that line straight, just try a bottom bouncer and a worm harness and just drift down the river. There are certain times of the year where the walleye cannot resist those worm harnesses. So give that a try, especially if you're new to river fishing for walleye. Give the worm harnesses a try. They're great. There's no rule book that says you have to vertical jig for walleye. It's just how I prefer to fish. Also, don't let anyone tell you that you can't get your limit of walleye later in the summer in these rivers, because you can. The walleye are there. You just have to figure out where they are in that water column, where they're feeding. But I can tell you now, I can catch walleye all summer long. I've been away on vacation before, come back from vacation in the summer, and the neighbors will give me a fishing report and they'll say, oh, the walleye, no one's really catching walleye anymore, they're only catching bass. And I will tell you, I will go out and I will catch walleye the next day, all day long. And it's just something that I have a knack for. You just have to figure out where they're relating in that water column. Later in the summer, I might transition to trolling a little bit more with the crankbait, depending where they are. But you can find them on the bottom, you can find them in the middle, you can find them on the top. You just have to figure out where they're feeding that time of day. I hope this video has helped you guys a little bit. If you see me out on the water this year, say hi. I'll probably be out there all spring unless I'm busy on the farm. This year I will be fishing out of a pro angler, so I will have a new kayak thanks to Folk Marine for hooking me up with the new Pro Angler 360. So I'm really looking forward to getting in the kayak and getting some walleye this spring. See you guys on the water.